Well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. It's just past noon. So welcome to the 12th annual Research Ethics Conference of the CCTSI. My name is Matt DeCamp. I am the Director of Research Ethics at CCTSI, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's event. It's going to be an intense time. I'll tell you a little bit about the event, but before I get too far, I want to make some important thank yous. The first is to thank, of course, the CCTSI, Dr. Ron Sokol and Tim Lockey for their support of this event as it's been occurring over the past now 12 years. As I understand, Dr. Sokol was recently named a distinguished professor here at the university, so special congratulations for that. And unexpectedly, to me at least, I also want to recognize the former director of research ethics at CCTSI, Marilyn Kors, is in the audience. Hello, welcome, Marilyn. Nice to see you. There is a committee that helps organize this event, and I want to recognize them as well. Jackie Glover, Barbara Hammock, David Badish, Gianna Morales, and Brian Jackson, whom you'll hear more about in a little bit because he'll be moderating part of today's event. So thanks to that committee as well. Nothing happens in this beautiful space without David Weil and Malia Himber. So David is over in the side here, who's helping shepherd us through today's event. Thank you, David and Malia. And last, of course, but not least, Danielle Chait has been helping organize this event as well, and really been someone I've been able to lean on to help organize all of this. I think she's outside, but certainly want to recognize Danielle as well. Sure, go ahead. We have a couple other housekeeping issues before we get started with the official part of the program. There is a break coming up in about an hour and 15 or an hour and a half. So just so folks know, there are bathrooms here on this level, as well as downstairs and upstairs. So feel free to use any of those during the break. When it comes time for the in-person Q&A, I ask that the in-person people in the room make sure that you press and hold the microphone to ask your question so that all can hear it. It's a press and hold, not a press and release. Press and hold, and keep holding while you answer your question. That'll be sure that everyone can hear us. For those who are participating on the Zoom, my colleague Ahmed Al-Azmar is monitoring the Zoom chat and will be relaying questions in from the chat again during the Q&A parts of today's session. Just to give you a little more about the structure of the event, we are going to have a keynote presentation that'll occupy about an hour, and then we'll have four, I think, very carefully selected presentations around ongoing active artificial intelligence, machine learning research here at the university. These presentations will occupy a spectrum of translation, and these will be really quick flash presentations followed by Q&A. And then we'll end the day with some comments from our keynote speaker. On that count, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce today's keynote speaker, Nicole Martinez-Martin. I'm from Stanford University. She has her JD from Harvard, also a PhD in medical anthropology and comparative development from the University of Chicago. And she uses these two lenses, this legal lens as well as an anthropology lens, to understand some of the real fundamental questions in research ethics around the use of digital mental health technologies. Parts of her work have focused on the Latin community, so she has an interest in vulnerable populations and underserved groups as well. Her work in bioethics spans neuroethics, digital phenotyping or computer vision, medical and behavioral applications of technologies, and she's a gifted teacher as well as a researcher there at Stanford University. She's had multiple grants extramurally funded to study some of these ethical issues in digital mental health technologies. And really at a personal level, I have to say, it's a great pleasure to welcome Nicole here because she and I were postdoctoral fellows together. I won't say how many years ago, when we were both at Johns Hopkins, and it's just a real pleasure to welcome you here, and we're interested in what you have to say. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you very much, Matt, for the kind words. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to speak. And thank you also to CCTSI. This is a a conference that covers a number of issues, and the flash talks, I'm really looking forward to them. So thank you very much for the invitation. And as my kind introduction said, I have been working at Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics. And my research has been in ethics of digital mental health and medical AI. My talk here today, I'll be bringing in some of the interview data that I have gathered in looking at digital phenotyping, ambient intelligence, which involves sensor data. It's an area where I have been able to interview a number of people developing and as well as clinicians and professionals applying mental health work for mental health apps and digital tools. To start with, in talking about some of the ethical challenges that are in AI, I wanted to start by talking about some of the bigger issues, what it is that, as AI and particularly applications of AI in healthcare and the medical field, what created those challenges? What made it seem as though AI in this area was bringing some new questions that would need to be explored? Some of it, of course, is just simply how data intensive AI is, which in itself brings in issues of ethics around collection, ethics around privacy, as well as questions around using that data that's gathered in large amounts in ways that provide benefit and that are fair to the different populations, the different places where the AI may be applied. Oversight in this area has also raised a number of questions in terms of how to appropriately exert oversight and accountability in this area. The FDA, which in the United States is the agency that evaluates medical devices, had a number of challenges in learning or figuring out how to evaluate these tools, for example. And there are a number of proposals that have been put forth in this area, and some of the things that make the challenge that more of a challenge is the distributed nature of the work that's involved, the pipeline in which there are a number of practices that go through that pipeline, as well as, of course, what often comes up are issues of explainability, for example, that with certain inputs, how you get to certain outputs, how that may be evaluated, as well as once that algorithm is released, what are the ways or what are that it will need to be evaluated downstream. And so those have all created a number of questions about oversight as well as accountability, that as you bring in new actors, new data scientists, as well as more people within industry who are creating these tools, and where the tools themselves, the goal is for them to become a part of practice, is how you might envision that accountability in these areas. And so those form some of the bigger challenges behind why medical AI has brought up a lot of ethical scrutiny in the recent past, despite all of the excitement. And I do have to underline the promise of where AI may be able to assist in many ways in the medical field. And underneath this, you can also see that there's these paradigm shifts, that we had ways of handling privacy already, privacy for health data, where it was protected by regulations like HIPAA that protected information that was generated in healthcare systems. But then as that became changed of where the data was being generated, where you might be collecting data from, that also in turn raised questions about whether the existing frameworks for protecting that privacy were sufficient. Most people agree they're not sufficient and have been trying to think of ways to address that. But it's because of the different ways that certain work gets done within AI that it's raised this need to think of different frameworks, different ways of protecting people, protecting groups within these situations. And part of that is the change in some cases to relationships, that many ethical obligations are rooted in the relationships that people have. Physician, patient, for example, within that relationship, there's certain obligations that arise out of it for protecting confidentiality, for, of course, doing no harm. And so again, as you have different actors coming into this field, where you have the developers coming in, some outside of academia or of medicine, is that question of, how do those ethical obligations, are there new ones that come up, and how does that travel? And just as a reminder, these end up being privacy, data protection, bias, fairness, safety, and accountability. These have tended to be really the main areas that get discussed within ethics of AI, that they attach to the things that I was just talking about, that because of the data intensiveness, because of the questions about whether existing frameworks are sufficient to protect in this space, there have been a lot of focus, especially on privacy and data protection. But of course, in recent years, bias and fairness has come up as a big concern. And as well, just the oversight of being able to ensure safety in this area. And it, of course, is important. Privacy is very important in this area. But it also raises questions about, is privacy, is part of where the focus on privacy is it's towards solutions where, people look towards, well, can we address this with some existing measures by changing consent a little bit? Is that a way to really address these kinds of privacy concerns? And part of the concern with needing to reflect a little more on the ways that we're coming at these ethical issues like bias and fairness or privacy are whether underneath it that the kinds of approaches that get looked at immediately are ones that reinforce existing status quo, that reinforce the existing power relations that exist within medicine, within AI, or whether there needs to be a more systemic approach in order to address the kinds of issues that come up, whether it's in bias or privacy. So today I'll be focusing more on talking about issues of equity, and I'll talk a bit about privacy, but raising those questions about how some of the practices, some of the approaches that have been proposed may also need to take more into account about the social context, about the systems in which these are taking place, if they are overall to meet goals of providing social benefit, through the AI, through the use of data. And so I'll start by focusing a little attention on just some of the underlining epistemologies or worldviews behind some of now the different professions involved in AI. And there has been some work looking at and raising concerns about, as the focus becomes on data collection, how that in itself may impact some of the ways that ethical obligations are thought about. So focusing on data and collecting, good data, whether sometimes that can end up minimizing the senses of responsibility to the people and to the groups who are behind that data. And this is not saying that this automatically happens at all, but it's saying that within data science, there are some indications that the professional obligations over the years have often been professional obligations towards, how they collect data, how they process data. And when you then put it in a new context or combine it in the context within medicine of making sure to have that awareness of how those data practices may in some ways clash or have tensions with some of the goals of medical AI, which again, is providing the social benefit. And here is work by Leonelli et al. In 2016, which looked at data practices and and noted that data scientists' accountability is often intertwined with technical questions around how labor is divided, whose expertise needs to be involved, how computer scientists, data analysts may at certain points need to communicate with field-specific experts. But in that way, it can make it more difficult to assign and determine who has responsibility for evaluating sometimes these broader goals about quality and about whether the tool that emerges from these practices is meeting these goals. And so it raises some questions in terms of how those data practices then in a field of medicine combined with a medical epistemology, which may assume the professional obligations that are meant towards scientific knowledge benefit, social benefit, and patient well-being. In looking at some examples, so last year, the NIH had a call for a data generation project, Bridge to AI, which a number of you may be familiar with. But I noticed this one comment in there where they were talking about using AI ML modeling that by transferring the emphasis on AI ML modeling and that data collection, is that a way of overcoming ethical challenges like privacy, ownership, moral distinctions in the data? And it suggests, underneath it, again, a sort of idea that you may have in just, simply collecting the data, the question of, what happens then to the obligations to the people behind that data that you might have in terms of privacy or thinking about, what their ownership is of that data overall. There's also work by Arlene Salz, which has talked about people's attention to creating AI and machine learning models and tools where a way of talking about those tools as, anthropomorphizing them in her words, but often assigning agency and talking about it as in, we're creating the tools that will make the decisions. That it's understandable, and it's a common language that people fall into, but it also, in her work, she found it associated with, how much people then didn't think as much about what the ethical obligations of the people are in those situations of, how you assign ethical obligations, how you assign within the institutions in the system, who has responsibility for different ethical obligations. And so in that light of, where there may be certain trends, within how AI is talked about, within some of the trends within data practices, within data science, these questions then of locating, what are the layers or what are the practices that then need to be considered? What are the data questions? If you are thinking in terms of, in this case, what I'll talk first as the example about is more issues of bias or fairness and how you think about the underlying obligations to provide social benefit, particularly to diverse populations, as these tools ultimately, hopefully will be able to do. And of course, this question of bias has received a lot of attention in recent years, and there's been a lot of talk about, how we can address this issue of bias within healthcare AI, within medical AI, and what these snippets up here from the news items about it. In some cases, it's the news items that brought attention, the studies that brought attention to, for example, there being bias in healthcare algorithms. The famous or the well-known Obermeyer case study where they looked at an algorithm in a large healthcare system that was systematically assigning Black patients less frequently to receive additional resources. And that was because, in many ways, because of the way it was using cost as a proxy or as a goal of reducing costs without thinking sufficiently about how Black patients within that system historically had often received fewer resources because of the way that they were socially situated, and which ended up simply being repeated and amplified then once that algorithm was applied. And there's a number of areas now that have brought attention to this area, this issue of bias and underlying issues of how different populations, diverse populations, may be treated differently, unfairly under the way that these tools have been developed. And so here is where, in talking about that, is bringing more attention again to what are the practices to look more systematically at how these issues of equity, how these issues of data may be addressed. And of course, there's been a number of suggestions simply in terms of making sure to include more people from diverse populations, which is very important in this area, within the data sets or in recruiting and building data sets, making sure that there's sufficient inclusion of different people. But to bring some attention also to other issues within the system of how data is collected, is to bring back to remember, data is representation. That in all the ways that data is collected, that there are choices involved in terms of who may be able to be visible in that data, who may be included in that data, and how thinking through those and reflecting upon the ways that different data sets, different ways of collecting data, then ultimately impacts the how that data is representing the populations that will need to be served. And so to talk about just, I'll give some examples from some common types of data sets that get used from AI in healthcare, like RCTs, EHRs, administrative records, and social media. So randomized controlled trials, they are common data sets that get utilized in building algorithms. One thing that has come up within these data sets is obviously they are the inclusion exclusion criteria means that it's limited to a certain population, but it's not always understood without more reflection, more looking at upstream ways that these data pools or participants for these data sets are impacted, that it may not always be apparent often how factors such as race, socioeconomic class, or other issues are impacting who appears in these data sets. So an example of that is with a study of racial bias for LVADs, and where they looked at that if you looked within the data collected itself, that there were fewer Black participants, fewer people from lower socioeconomic status. But initially, when they were looking at the algorithms, they weren't finding that big of a difference in how those people were treated by the algorithm and what the outcome was. But when they looked further upstream and looked at the exclusion inclusion criteria for who would even be receiving LVADs, it became rapidly apparent that there's a lot of non-clinical factors that can influence it, such as how much social support a certain group is perceived as having, or comorbidities, whether people are seen as having, or whether people have additional illnesses or disorders that would exclude them. And that once they were looking more at those upstream impacts, they were seeing how the reasons why there were actually a number of different differences in who was actually represented in that data set that they were using, and seeing that ultimately that if they were going to use that algorithm for other purpose, for downstream purposes, then that may ultimately end up leading towards some biased outcomes. And so having to think that through. And in a number of these areas, what's very difficult is as much as there now are a number, such as All of Us, for example, is, real pushes to have more inclusive practices for different diverse populations in recruitment for biomedical research, that it can be very hard at the same time to extricate, from these data sets, the way that social inequities ultimately shape those data sets. So electronic health records are a big example of this issue that in being used for different algorithms, that they may have a lot of missing data, that is more missing data for certain groups, people who are low income, Medicaid populations, because they're less likely to have continuity in primary care providers. They often will have missing data then in those data sets, as well as simply differences in the health system patient populations. And then what becomes even harder to extricate are physician biases. That there's a number of studies that have come out in recent years that, for example, with Black patients, that pain complaints are taken less seriously, that there's often less interventions or treatment that is prescribed for Black patients, which can lead to sort of a host of downstream ways that data ends up being biased, but that can be much more difficult to try and extricate then from how that data may be used in order to inform a particular algorithm. And there's also studies such as geographic bias in medical AI tools, finding that patient data, much of the patient data that was being used to inform AI diagnostic tools was coming mainly from 3 states. And so, needing attention then to how the ways that the particular context of those states, of those health systems, may then be impacting, how that data then ends up having social benefit down the line when used for AI modeling. Administrative data sets, so for example, insurance claims or otherwise also have, in keeping with what I was just talking about, those same kinds of limitations. And then in an area where I've been doing more work is in how social media and how sensor data is being collected and being used for AI tools. And there's already the more obvious ways that those data sets may have certain limitations. People with internet access, people who use English as a primary language. And there's a real need to understand, though, overall, what kinds of ways that people whose data is being collected through sensors or through digital health tech, what are the characteristics of that data? How might different people be underrepresented or overrepresented, and are there ways to address that? And this comes from an interviews that I was doing regarding digital mental health tools. And what they were remarking is that sometimes these factors can be simply the way that the tool is designed. In this case, with meditation apps, which they were using in order to try and collect some different data. But someone who was a clinician was saying it was very hard for them to get their low-income Black or Latina clients to use these apps, because simply the way they were designed, those clients did not think that they were for them. They were thinking, these are for white yoga moms. These are not for me. And that is the kind of thing that also can impact, who's using it, and then what kind of data comes out of it ultimately. And with sensor data, which may be that there's sensors collecting visual information, temperature data, things along those lines, which sometimes referred to as ambient intelligence. There's also the issue of data annotation, that it's often with these kinds of data, it's often something that's under-examined, but the people who are annotating that data, depending on what cultural background they come from, there can be a real difference. As one person was saying, smiling has a lot of different cultural rules around it. Who is smiling under what circumstances, and if people who are annotating it may not be as informed of the cultural rules or the reasons why someone might move their mouth in a certain way, that data may be annotated in ways that are skewing the data that results from it, particularly for populations that are not the predominant population in that area. And that came up a lot as I was talking to developers in ambient intelligence, was these concerns then around labeling and categorization and the nuances that can sometimes get lost, and that can ultimately then affect how those tools end up working. And underneath it are these questions also of, who's visible in this data. This particularly comes up with sensor data, but it also applies to electronic health records or otherwise, that, people who have disabilities, depending on the disability, there may be different ways that that doesn't ever get, categorized or labeled within the data set that it's looked at. Or there may be reasons preventing those people from, with the sensor data, for example, that was in one project that we were looking at, was where the sensors were located actually made it so that wheelchair users may actually not be able to be, have their data captured as much. And the same goes with, LGBTQIA+, how they may be labeled in the data sets or otherwise, immigration issues. And also when we're talking just broader global issues regarding these data sets, low to middle income countries, there can be real differences in, how their data sets label certain things, what they have access to, that can make, bigger differences in terms of whether, people from those areas will ultimately be able to get some benefit from the tools that are being collected. And of course, this thorny problem overall of, how to incorporate data on social context, that, in coming up with data that, that often with health disparities research, people from diverse populations, there's these questions of, when is it a matter that, race may be relevant, and often what's underneath it are these social determinants of health. And, capturing that in ways that are measurable, that can be used as part of AI tools can be very challenging in a lot of ways. And to take a step back even from the data sets, one of the really important questions, and this came up in a number of the interviews, are simply what questions are being asked in the first place, especially since many of these data sets, that the practice is that a data set is available, let's see what we can make of it. And so that data may or may not have certain features that are conducive, to the particular question that someone is trying to ask. And so really framing that research question around, whether that data set is appropriate for asking these questions, and who, is in that data set, so that the question, who that question framing is going to benefit, can be very much a question that impacts downstream, how beneficial these tools, how beneficial the algorithm ends up being, but also simply at the funding level, which questions are being asked of these data sets are also can be really important in terms of the funding, and whether these questions are being asked in the first place about what kind of differences may exist in different populations that ultimately impact who these are benefit for. And this certainly came up a number of times with research on COVID. And there was a number of examples with research from COVID of, this question of, if you're selecting a feature of interest and gathering that information about race or ethnic background, that it is of course important for inclusion goals of making sure that, research-wise, you're including a sufficiently diverse group of people, but then what it means in terms of the answers that you're getting, that when you have higher rates of Black and Latina populations getting COVID, then is that a reason that is because of racial or ethnic background, which generally that was found not to be the case. But instead, the issue being of how do you then capture, if it's these social determinants of health, of making sure that that's coming through in the research question and the way that the data set is being handled. And diversity among the researchers is also very important in this area, both in terms of how people approach the different data sets, and what kinds of questions are being asked. And this was a developer of digital mental health who brings up geographic representation or geographic bias as one of the things that they were concerned about, because they were saying, coming from Silicon Valley, coming from the Bay Area, that their team was primarily comprised of people who are into tech from that area. And they said it does create bias in how they do their development, how they're thinking about even creating these tools. That often there was even a lot of assumptions about other people who were going to be the ones needing to use these tools in order to benefit from them. Just baseline assumptions about them, about how much that they were willing to use tech or what kinds of tools that would benefit them. This is what I at one point was thinking of almost as like an imagined user that a number of these people developing the digital health tools had, where in creating, they wanted to create games, games to gather data, games to help people with mental health. And many of the people I talked to had that they themselves were white males, and they imagined or thought that most likely who would be using these tools would be young men like themselves. And in this case, it was kind of funny because it turned out to their surprise that it was middle-aged women who actually were the ones who, for a variety of reasons, really actually took to using these tools and were the ones who were actually, being the ones who benefited from that. So in this case, it was a little funny in terms of it ended up being a different population that they thought of for this. But it's also a reminder of how that often impacts the tool development, is that because of people's own identity, who they imagine that it's for, and how that in different ways influences their decisions about how they're creating these tools, what kind of data or planning is going into these tools. And to give, I'm using this example to give a little more of a walkthrough of just how some of the different issues that I've been talking about, how they apply. Was that one woman I was talking to, she was creating an app that was meant to be of use to underserved communities for maternal mental health. She was particularly concerned with assisting Black women with things like postpartum depression, but other mental health issues. And it was interesting really talking through some of the struggle that she had in putting this together. And she was saying, first of all, finding the research that could even go into developing her own tool was often hard. That when she would actually look a little deeper at some of the assessment tools, and she would realize that a number of the assessment tools that themselves had been tested primarily on white women, white affluent women as their population, and so it was a different population than what she was aiming at. And her concern then of where am I going to get the right surveys, or how do I create a survey or assessment tool that may be more sensitive to the differences that may come up with the underserved communities that I'm trying to serve here. And that came up down the line for her was a lot of questions about how this tool, given the population she was trying to work with, what kind of data sets that she could use for it, what kind of assessment tools, and concerns about whether there just needed to be different ways to measure or evaluate maternal mental health in the populations that she was trying to reach. And also in providing in creating these tools and thinking through it, she was also trying to find the information, the support where there might need to be more ways of accounting for social differences, different ways that needing help may be communicated, the different language that might help signal more, a supportive educational app for this particular population. And in her case, it was also, really marked that she was not part of, or she was having trouble connecting to some of the larger support or funding, in order to be able to develop the app because of her placement sort of outside of those communities. And it brings up, though, kind of down the line, some of these questions about how problems are framed, what some of the particular issues can be in trying to serve an understudied population and serve them for what she was really, her goal was primarily about how do you benefit these women who really may need these different services in this area. And so again, it's these questions of, how do you recognize not just, that within the particular data set that, maybe people from, different racial, different ethnic communities may need to be included in them, but overall recognizing, how the impact of the overall inequities within the healthcare system, the social inequities might apply. Intersectionalism, is a word that has gotten a lot more use, a lot more people interested in it in the last couple of years. And I would just note here that within thinking through also intersectionally in this area, it can be a matter not just of saying, okay, well, I also need to look at because you're trying to look at not just how women are impacted, but how people who have these intersecting identities, where you may be, Latina and a woman, or LGBTQIA plus, these other identities, and how they're impacted. That it's not just a matter of sort of analyzing, that all these different subgroups exist and what they may be doing, but more thoroughly thinking through the way that people in these positions are affected differently by the social structures, by the social system around them. And, again, thinking it through in terms of, data sets or some of these digital tools being developed, thinking through then, what might be different questions that need to be asked, what might be different ways that these communities need to be engaged. And I bring this up briefly as with privacy, that as much as privacy has gotten a lot of attention, that one area of it, I think, that is sometimes not given as much attention in this area, is how the distribution of risks and benefits for different groups actually may be different in terms of privacy. Our privacy laws in this country actually have been gendered and racialized in many ways, that they often come out of a very obvious example being abortion, and the way that it has been conceptualized as a sort of gendered privacy kind of claim, but also how the way that data gets used can impact different groups differentially. And so in looking at how not protecting data, having data that can provide health inferences or otherwise may get used, it can impact different groups differently. And certainly with financial or employment data, it's been seen or found that Black people, Latina people, that they may have more impact in terms of mortgage rates, when that information gets used downstream, or on certain aspects of employment. And so these can have the problems with protecting privacy also can have downstream impacts that are different on different groups, and that's something that needs to be taken into account. And particularly, there's a framing of predatory inclusion that in some cases, so for example, in the field of education, there has been talk about, well, you're including, there's been a big drive to include lower income people people from minoritized backgrounds more in education, but it also may have, set them up then more for student loans, predatory student loans. And that's a sort of big example of predatory inclusion. And so, and talking to different people, I've also been thinking about, how there may be ways not as extreme as that, but if you are including, working to include, different groups as part of, biomedical research, but not sufficiently thinking through how that work may actually, ultimately benefit those groups. And yet, still there may be ways because of the way that, data sets, even de-identified when they're made public can have these impacts on these groups, that you may be having a different risk benefit profile ultimately, despite overall the the overall beneficial goal of inclusion. And certainly in terms of sensor data, one of the things that all right. Not advancing. Yeah. Just advance the slide. Advance it. I kind of wonder if it's just battery. All right. Would you be able to advance it? I just have a few more slides. Yes, all right. And so, just in terms of, how privacy concerns may also hit different groups differently. This has come up in working on, certain projects, when I've worked on certain projects that relate to sensor data in particular, is the increasing recognition, especially post-Dobbs, of how people's health information can end up being used in ways that expose them to, in case of Dobbs, to criminal liability or otherwise. And it's a very intense example, but so, I have, worked with people who, for example, are doing a smart toilet, for research purposes, with the goal of, there's a lot of great information, health information that you can get from excretions. But at the same time, with post-Dobbs, we really had to talk, with the researchers about really thinking through, what data they actually needed to gather about this, what kind of inferences might come from that data, because you wouldn't, just to be very cautious in this area, because that there were certain people that, people who menstruate, people who could get pregnant, who, included in the research population, may have to have additional concerns, regarding, how those privacy interests are thought about and protected through the research design. And so, in looking at, these various ways, of course, the goal is, how the uses of data, the tools that provide social benefit, and what are some of these practices that people have been arriving at that help support those goals. And I've already talked about a few of them, but some of it is about a reflection process in doing research in these areas, or in creating tools in these areas, of really thinking through from early on, what group level harms are, what the social implications might be, Consider, what are the bigger goals? What are the desirable outcomes that you want to have of this model? And, working with different groups, making sure there's a diversity of researchers, but also doing more to engage the different communities and stakeholders who may be impacted by this, but also maybe in the past haven't been sufficiently included in how these research questions are being framed, how these goals are being discussed, in order to get that input on research questions, on data collection practices, as well as in those areas that help you better understand, that help researchers better understand what might be happening in these data sets that they were not aware of, that impact who is in these data sets, and what kinds of conclusions can be drawn from them. And that includes not just domain experts at key points, but really interdisciplinary, that whether it's from sociology, whether it's from history or otherwise, that they often have insights that can be useful to bring in to discussing how these tools may be made more equitable, how this research may be done in more equitable ways that fulfills the promise of medical AI for healthcare, that can truly benefit diverse populations.
There we go. Thank you, Nicole. It's a really great presentation. We're going to have plenty of time now for Q&A. I thought I might start with a question while we collect some from the chat and people think of some here in the room. I have a lot, but I was struck at the end. I have a sense that there's a gap between the really important big picture privacy bias framing issues that you so eloquently elaborated for us, and then the on the ground researcher or PI using data sets. And I just wonder, how do we think about bridging that gap? Who's responsible for it? Our investigators, our PI, IRBs? What do you think about? Maybe I'm wrong, there's no gap, but what do you think about that?
No, I think that's a really good question, because as I was talking about earlier, that is part of the issue, are identifying those responsibilities and how they're divided and who has them. And I think there's not one answer that IRBs, for the good that IRBs can serve, particularly in looking to protect individual participants, that IRBs don't really serve those concerns of how you think about how groups may be impacted or otherwise. And that's where I think bringing in some of those practices of getting some more input. Mm-hmm. But again, I think there is this sort of question of how you make that happen. That is it really up to each PI to have to try and engage stakeholders with each time. And I think that there's probably a couple of different approaches to that. Some places have come up with different types of ethic review boards that maybe an institution has, that's more informal, but that can serve as a resource and be able to use by different PIs and different people who are involved in research. Some of it is aiming at funding mechanisms, trying to aim some change at funding mechanisms, and the NIH has been moving in that area, of course, of trying to address diversity more meaningfully, but that's also an area that seems as though once you have more of the funding levers in place, then I think people who are engaging in the research see it more as a necessity. And then
the idea of a separate board is interesting. You could imagine IRBs may need some additional expertise around AI, machine learning, privacy. Questions in the room. We have plenty of time for questions, and I know there may be some online, but questions here in person. Feel free to just press the button, raise your hand, hold the button, and chime in. Go ahead, please.
So, just to follow up Matt's question, so that everything we talk about like representation, inclusion, actually they all come with a cost. So, and it all boils down to resources available to be like fully, let's say, theoretical, to reach the theoretical full inclusion. It's almost impossible resource-wise. So then how can we should we prioritize like who really should be included at like or as we have resources? Because like if you want to include like for racial wise, maybe then collect data from other town. And if you want to include people with language barriers, then recruit translator. If you want to include low socioeconomic status, then they provide childcare. So these are all means resources. And in practice, again, in the grant level, researcher may not have all the resources to have full inclusion. So what is the strategy, practical strategy here?
So I think in a couple of ways, and I think that is a really good point. And that's why I was trying to say in the last one, it is too much of a burden to just simply place the burden on individual PIs, that there needs to be some systemic changes, whether it's funding or otherwise. I think part of a basic question, though, in terms of what you're asking is also who's the target population. You're saying, well, full inclusion isn't possible, but if it's, if where it's going to be used, it involves, sort of the range of diversity, you do have to, it is useful to think of if this tool actually works, if what you're funding is something that's going to work, and you want it to be able to work for your target population. So I mean, that's sort of one issue. And one way that I think some people have proposed with it too is fully understanding that tools are going to be created in a given context, and obviously there's questions about how they may work in different contexts, but perhaps make it more part of the process of how they're approved, of staging approvals in terms of what context, gathering the information about how they work in different contexts with different populations as they're rolled out over time. But certainly, I think overall, I agree. It's not at all an easy question, and a lot of this underneath it all gets to, in order to actually get to that point, you need broader systemic changes that are going to support that. And I certainly advocate them, but I also understand that these things are constrained by different resources. But I also think of, in talking to this one data scientist where, he said, we keep making AI that doesn't work. And I was really surprised because a lot of the people I talk to don't say it doesn't work. They'll be like, oh, it works, but it just doesn't work for these and that people. And that was the kind of reconceptualization that I found really interesting of, whose perspective it's from and what goals you're serving, in that when you put it that way, that you're putting funding into making AI that doesn't work, then you may think a little bit more about what systemic changes are needed than to make it so that it actually does work, at least for the things that you're trying to say that it works for. So
thank you.
Jackie.
Thanks for an excellent summary or overview. Speaking of gaps, is it working? Mm-hmm. Speaking of gaps, I really like Matt's question, but in terms of bringing it down to practicality, how do you bridge the gap between public, the academy, and all private development?
That's a huge question. Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a number of kind of proposals out there, and it really is a difficult area to think of, especially the industry academic, because whether it's the type of where their funding is getting and what kind of levers there are to even have certain incentives. I think is definitely difficult, and I haven't seen a proposal that completely bridges that. But some of it is the trying to bring in some more work with industry, with academia, and working more so that there can end up being framed some more general guidance that hopefully people find the reasons to buy into, whether it's buying in because there's a need to not be embarrassed down the line, or that in some ways it may make more financial sense in order to try and address these kinds of problems, so that you have a tool that does more sort of broadly serve these social goals. But definitely that has been a thorny issue, particularly when it comes to buy-in, because I said there's different incentives, different mechanisms for getting buy-in, and it becomes a little harder outside of the kind of academic funding kind of models.
Do you, just in follow-up, do you think that the relationships between academic institutions and AI companies have been, should be subject to the same sort of scrutiny that we've sometimes applied to more traditional drug development companies? Has it been the same? Should it be the same? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think especially being situated in Silicon Valley, I mean, it's an interesting thing because of the way that people jump between, their startup and academia. I certainly think that there needs to be certainly more scrutiny in that area about how that works. And particularly to me in terms of, again, what kinds of incentives it creates in what directions, whether it's for how data is used, and how people, whether there's benefit from that data that's being gathered or whether it's the AI tools. But yeah, I certainly would be in favor of there being some more scrutiny and probably more guidance about how that works.
Have any questions in the chat? Has anyone chatted in a question, Ahmed? Or okay, and then I'll come back to you.
So this question is from Sharon Devine, and she wants to know, in what ways or whether even IRBs can incorporate these aspects into regulatory reviews, and what kinds of screens or questions would be, applicable?
Yeah, I mean, some of that's hard because I mean, certain things are really more outside their purview, at least of some of the issues that I brought up. The kind of downstream implications and all of that is just generally has not been part of the IRB. What they're expected to do. And, that's where, I mean, with the work of IRBs, there's certainly been discussion of, whether there needs to be, whether it's at an institution or a sort of shared resource of expertise, that can be utilized when IRBs are evaluating these kinds of projects. But that's also where, and why I was bringing up different kinds of ethical review boards that have been proposed, is because a number of these types of concerns are simply outside of what IRBs are expected to do and expected to evaluate in terms of the project in front of them. And that's where it may be needed to sort of think through whether, again, on the institutional level or more of a sort of shared resource level, whether there would need to be, these kinds of reviews. And I think that's come up sometimes when they talk about, whether it's algorithmic assessment, or audits or those kinds of things, that, there has sometimes been discussion of them, not just in terms of disparate outcomes, but also, whether there should be some more kind of ethical questions that get threaded through these assessments, that more algorithms are expected to, then be reviewed in that way for those.
I remember when I sat on an IRB and questions came up around data use within social media. One of the first things I ever did as a member was I just went to the terms and conditions. And sometimes the terms would say things like, these data can't be used for research. And that made the review really short. I think you had a question.
All right, I think I figured out how this works now. Thank you, everyone. I think what I'm going to do is be proposing a kind of a model through which we may be able to move towards action from research and across these different scales. And no doubt, by proposing that model, I'll also be raising all kinds of additional questions, comments, and concerns. I'm with the Department of Neurology, and one of the things that we're attempting to do there is have community action boards representing different groups that are available to our department so that researchers needn't be entirely responsible for reproducing this every time. They can take their ideas to this board and run it by them. And if trouble is identified then that needs a larger kind of scale, then that can be kicked up the academic ladder first, having representatives from the board talk with the IRB or other administrators at the university, and if necessary from there, move government, what have you. I'm just curious, is this something that other departments are trying? There are pitfalls, and I'm just curious what people think about this as a way of moving towards action across different scales.
I know I've certainly seen some efforts in those areas. So yeah, at Stanford with like ethics review boards or the ethic review board that they put together, it's interdisciplinary. And I think, you know, what you're saying, I think that, you know, a model using some more community involvement, you know, is actually very useful in a lot of ways. But I think that in some cases, what was really valuable with it wasn't it as a sort of stop go kind of thing for the researchers involved. And in the case of our ethical review board, you know, they can't like stop a project at all. There's no way that they can stop a project. But what was actually useful was the discussion. And I think that I think there's actually a lot of good that comes of it, because what we found is that after a few of the initial discussions, more researchers came to the board already knowing what kinds of issues they should be thinking through, and it had almost a kind of useful educational component to it. Of once they were hearing people and hearing, oh, these are the things that this particular project, you know, makes people worried about. They thought about it for the next project that they had. And then there was discussion among them. And so that's where I think, you know, as you said, there can be downsides and you know, nuances to how these kinds of things get implemented. But I think, you know, even that process where, you know, if people are going to sort of come together and have the conversation and learn more about, you know, what kind of constraints there are on this, or what kinds of concerns there might be in the community, or about the impact of this, that it can have real value just in that in itself. Because I found a lot of researchers were actually quite open to hearing about it and quite open to thinking about it the next time that they had a project that they did.
John, do you have a question?
Yeah, so I direct the IRB here, and I don't like the idea of getting in the middle of that. But what you just said was, you know, resonated with me, because the other piece of this problem is the problem could arise at the beginning of the project. It could arise at the very end of the project, and the IRB only looks at it at a very specific time.
Right.
And I think it would be, I like the value add of the possibility of iterative input and discussion, as opposed to the stop and go, you know, point. And, you know, industry now has like social responsibility officers, that sort of thing. So it could be a committee, something along those lines that can work, I think, a little more fluidly with research groups and collegially. I like that model.
Yeah, no, definitely those things. I think those practices can be really helpful overall. And I mean, industry is also, I think, interesting in the sense of when some of the kind of initial ethical issues come up around, you know, data come up or otherwise, that a lot of companies have a kind of compliance model of, well, just tell us what boxes we have to check. But I think these kinds of practices that can make it more of an ongoing discussion or an ongoing sort of understanding of why certain issues matter, I think can be really helpful in that regard as well. So that it's not just simply, okay, now we have a consent box that they can check, and we've taken care of it. But having that information to sort of think through of how it might work through organizationally, how you address these different concerns that get raised.
I think we may have time for one more question before we move on. Go ahead, Brian.
So a lot of the problems that you identify seem to have parallels in research ethics in other fields that aren't artificial intelligence. And so I'm curious about how you see these concerns as new or just different in scale from what's existed previously in research ethics.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And some of it goes back to what I was bringing up in the beginning, that some of it isn't just right. You obviously have these kinds of privacy concerns. So some of it has to do with, or some of what makes it different, or have a different kind of cast in the AI area, are things like the practices, the data practices that make some of the responsibilities more distributed, that can make it more difficult pinning down responsibility. Just some of the changes in how you evaluate, these different tools, I think, have created these challenges that make it different in this area in terms of coming up with what are the ways to address this, these particular issues. And I know that with sort of any new technology, there's ways that they may challenge the previous paradigm, but it feels like there's several issues all at once within AI in terms of balancing protection of data with the social benefit that can come from that data, and how that interacts with existing privacy laws that really had a very different concept of where sensitive data comes from. And so that also has raised some new issues or new questions in this particular.
Great, thank you. Let's thank Nicole. Thank you for a great talk.
Everyone, thank you for the questions.
And I'll